well, very good. Thank you guys for coming today. We're really excited about this life sciences biotech panel. My name is Jerry Lee. I'm a partner at Goldman Sachs, heading up our biopharma business. To my left is Adrian Brown from Eli Lilly, Henry Gosebrook from Nomura, and Steve Paul from many companies, including Karuna Therapeutics. I'm going to ask each of them to give a little bit of their backgrounds, and then we'll talk a little bit about the capital markets, the health of the ecosystem, private companies and therapeutic areas of interest, and I'm sure a focus for many of you, just what is the M&A market looking like these days? Adrian?
Yes, good afternoon. Adrian Brown, Eli Lilly and Company. I've worked at Lilly for 21 years across a variety of commercial strategy roles, and now I'm leading corporate business development for the company, and local here to the Indianapolis area. I live in Carmel with my family.
Thank you, Adrian. Henry?
Great, Henry Gosebrook. So I spent 21 years at JP Morgan doing mergers and acquisitions, and was the co-head of M&A for North America. And then a good client, AbbVie, called me to come join and work for the CEO to really, build the company that AbbVie is today. So going from a kind of so-so pharma company to really a nice scale company through, some deals and investing in innovation. So we've done the Allergan transaction as an example, the Skyrizi deal that was with Boehringer Ingelheim. And I had a great time there and was always intrigued about biotech. And another former client of mine called me to run his company called Nomura when he was ready to move on to chairman. So that's what I've been doing the last year and a half. So we're a public CNS-based company focused on depression, schizophrenia, Alzheimer's, a bunch of other really very important indications that we really hope to make a difference in.
Dr. Paul?
Steve Paul is my name. I think I've been employed by every element of the ecosystem. You can tell I'm a little old. I spent almost 20 years at the NIH in academia. I'm a physician scientist doing sort of clinical and bench work. Moved to Eli Lilly in 1993 and was involved in leading some of the neuroscience programs there, including the launch of Zyprexa and Cymbalta, some of our bigger products in those days. Spent 17 wonderful years at Lilly. The last 7 I was head of R&D. Retired in 2010, thought I'd try my hat at starting my own company, so I co-founded Sage Therapeutics and Voyager Therapeutics with Third Rock Ventures, both public companies, and then more recently Karuna Therapeutics, a company that was just acquired by Bristol Myers Squibb, developing a new schizophrenia medicine, and more recently have co-founded Rapport Therapeutics, which went public a couple of months ago, and now I'm working on a new company, Seaport Therapeutics, doing depression and anxiety drugs. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
I think we're very lucky today to actually have this specific set of perspectives. So you've got a head of M&A for the largest healthcare company now in the world. You've got a person who had advised large caps, small caps, mid caps at a bank, and now between that and AbbVie, now really operating a biopharma biotech. And then Steve Paul, again, a very prolific company progenitor who has sold companies, licensed companies, and the like. For the purposes of our discussion, I'd love to see, who in the audience is in biotech or life sciences, just so we can kind of craft our, okay. And then who is working as an operator at a biotech, meaning you're not an investor, okay. Are there any investors in the audience? Okay, that's helpful. Thank you, Derek, for raising your hand every time.
All of the above.
The mayor of Carmel here. Okay, so why don't we start with a little bit of the health of the ecosystem, okay? And so I think for those in biotech, these facts are probably not lost upon you. We are in our kind of 3rd year of biotech IPO malaise. And the reason I highlight that is because it really affects every single person on this panel, and very likely you, the health of the public markets as to how they think about their opportunity space. No matter what perch you're in, it impacts you as well. So if you rewind back to before COVID, on a general year, you'd see about 3 or 4 dozen IPOs in biotech every year. COVID hit, we saw 2 years of 70 plus IPOs for each of those 2 years, but for the last 3 years, this year included, you've really only seen a dozen each year. Of the 11 that we've seen so far this year, 7 are below water, meaning they're trading below where the IPOs were priced. Rapport, thankfully, has been performing very well as one of the 4 that are performing well. But I think the main takeaway is where we are in the capital markets, it is a relatively challenged IPO market, which is why we've seen a lot of private companies continue to raise capital via VC, venture capital, via their private company funders. So VC this year has been about $20 billion of volume, which while smaller than over the last few years is still relatively healthy. And then lastly, as another aspect or symptom of the malaise in the capital markets, many private companies are choosing to sell. So tying a lot of these themes together, we're seeing a lot of private companies now sell instead of try to go public. And so this year so far, you've seen $20 billion of private company biotech M&A, which as of August has already surpassed the entire year of 2023. And so a little bit of a backdrop, as I'll now start with Adrian. Adrian, from your perch at Lilly, you think about new technologies, modalities, new platforms that Lilly can continue to play in. When you see and hear about companies, I'm sure you have your own perspectives on the health of the ecosystem, whether it's related to companies that are thinking about IPO, private companies you're looking at, and the like. Your thoughts?
I'd agree with your take on the overall environment. You know, as we think about sort of M&A strategy at Lilly, I don't know that it's had as much of an impact in terms of how we are executing our strategy. For Lilly in particular, we're often looking for sort of the breakthroughs of the future. We're looking to solve for the next decade and beyond, which often leads us to look at earlier stage opportunities. And I think, you know, when we find companies that are executing on great ideas and making progress on great ideas, those aren't typically the companies that are in distress, but it can at times lead to a particular transaction structure or strategy, but that's not so much something that we're seeking, but more so influenced by the perspective of the partner.
Makes sense. Henry?
Yeah, I mean, I speak a little bit about my old job, similar to what Adrian's doing now at Lilly. That was my role at AbbVie. And look, at the end of the day, it all starts with what are the patient needs and what is the science that can possibly tackle those needs. And you know, overall, I would say that look, there's still significant need in many areas, but certain areas that were more popular perhaps from a deal perspective a few years ago, like oncology, they're just getting more crowded, and it's hard to really have a clearly differentiated opportunity versus, you know, some areas. So Steve and I spent obviously most of our time now in neuroscience, and there you've had a bit of a dearth of opportunity for maybe 10, 15 years, but now there's a big wave of new innovation where finally we know we had a lot of targets that long have been thought to be important targets, but you know, we didn't have the chemistry tools, or we didn't have the ability to really unlock those targets, or we didn't really know how to develop them correctly. So Steve did a phenomenal job with Karuna on that, where again, it was a target that people kind of known for a long time, but the development really wasn't optimal in the past. And so, you know, what's helpful is that certainly neuroscience, and then of course obesity being the other one, these are very large problems for society, and so we do need medicines that actually, you know, work better or are more tolerable. And as long as I think companies can create those opportunities, the market will be healthy. But look, it's a bit more selective now. Not every pharma wants to do everything either. So certain pharmas want certain things, whereas maybe 15 years ago, 20 years ago, kind of everybody would look at everything. It's a little bit more refined now. But I guess given my role as a biotech CEO, I'm very optimistic, of course, on the future of the deal environment. And I think we'll have once we're through this year, I think, and we see some of that signs emerging, I think we'll have a pretty robust market for years to come.
Steve, obviously, despite the malaise, you've taken companies public and founded new companies this year. Your thoughts?
Yeah, well, maybe just to start, I think it all starts with the scientific substrate. What are we working with? And I know people say this like every 5 years, but the irony of it is this is like unbelievable time to be discovering new medicines, right? Or developing new medicines. The science has never been more interesting, richer. The fundamentals of disease biology, whether it be the etiology or the pathophysiology, you know, increasing information. So we're able to do things for people, for patients, that we've never been able to do before. And I do agree, it involves all elements of the ecosystem. We need healthy big pharma. We need healthy academia on the other end of the equation. And we need investors that are going to step up and kind of make that work, that transition work. And I sort of look at it in time horizons. Right now, Jerry, I agree with you. I think things are a little tougher in the short run. You need, and Henry said it best, people are discriminating. If you don't have something that looks like it's going to be a medicine or a product, it's going to be a hard sell today. But I think we also have to think about the cycles in our industry, that medium term and long term, assuming, you know, the Inflation Reduction Act doesn't get more draconian, and Jerry, you better discuss that than me, I think the ecosystem will stay healthy through the ups and the downs. But it is a little tougher now, for sure. I went from Lilly, you know, my budget wasn't anywhere near what it is now, Adrian, but I went from a $4.5, $5 million a year R&D budget to now being a professional beggar. So I go out and beg for money. But we've done okay in terms of getting investors interested in ponying up and making it work. So I think we shouldn't get too crazy about the near-term stuff. It is a challenge. And by the way, if you're out trying to raise a private round, or as Jerry mentioned, you're trying to go public, it's tough. But I think the future is pretty bright. I think we can do some things in biomedical research, and broadly speaking, diagnostics and all that stuff that we couldn't dream about 5 years ago.
I couldn't agree with that more. I would say, I'm sure our panelists would agree in general, this is very much a golden age of biotechnology. To be a human today, and as long as there's capital underwriting all of this science, is a very special time. I think we're going to solve things in the next 10 years that we couldn't possibly have thought could be solvable 50 years ago. Adrian, I'm going to take an aside really quick. I think Henry briefly touched upon therapeutic areas of interest in his prior role. Obviously, both of our other panelists today are focused on CNS today. Lilly sits across multiple therapeutic areas that, of course, have come to the fore over the last couple of years across CNS oncology and, of course, these days, cardiometabolic and obesity. How are you thinking about investing across multiple areas in therapeutic indications?
Yeah, our interests are quite broad. So to your point, I'd say the first place that I'd start is within the therapeutic areas that we are today, cardiometabolic, immunology, oncology, neuroscience. There we're continuing to look for areas of unmet need, targets we're excited about that maybe we weren't able to pursue internally or make the progress we were looking for, or potentially new modalities and technologies to address targets that we have conviction around. We're all in on continuing to build upon our therapeutic areas of expertise, but we're also solving for the future and back to a healthy kind of biotech ecosystem. We have a large part of our BD organization that's really just focused on white space areas that we aren't in today, and finding great biotechs that are working on great ideas that we can come alongside and try to meet their needs where they are, whether that be funding, whether that be community and lab space, expertise from Lilly from a development standpoint, or even mentorship. So there, our interests are, you name it, we're looking at everything. Yeah.
For the audience's benefit, I think what Henry and Adrian have referred to is there really have been kind of ebbs and flows over the course of the last decade or so across therapeutic areas of interest, both for investors as well as large caps. Like you can imagine, those ecosystems are very much connected. When you think about M&A, the largest areas of M&A have really been oncology. It is cancer, all. Rare disease, because there's been some larger M&A, specifically in rare disease, the last couple of years, and then places like I&I, CNS, and now cardiometabolic have now come to the fore. And so because of that M&A, we now see investors much more focused in those areas as well. I think Henry's good point about we've now really seen a renaissance in CNS, partly because of Steve Paul and some of his colleagues have really pushed through some of these targets that people didn't think could work. And so I think a lot of us are very much excited about that. Why don't we pivot a little bit to the M&A side of the equation? Oh, please.
One comment, because
please.
Before I forget, I'm getting dementia. But it's hard to actually predict the future, right? I don't know, there's a Yogi Bear or something in there, but anyway.
Predictions are hard, especially when you talk about the future.
You know, think about this. 10 years ago, who was interested in obesity?
Right.
When I was at Lilly, if I tried to sell an obesity program, fen-phen, remember all that stuff?
Laughed out of the room.
Forget it.
Yeah.
Forget it. Lilly, and they've done an absolutely marvelous job, Adrian, you went through diabetes. You got there and you said, wow, these, in fact, we had trouble making a GLP-1 in the days that I was there. They all seemed to produce an inflammatory response when we injected them in the skin. We bought a company called Amylin, and they had a Gila Monster GLP-1 called exenatide, which wasn't a great drug. I don't mean to offend anybody, but then we finally got Trulicity, and then bingo. And the folks at Lilly have just done an unbelievable job. But who would have gone after obesity? Another area that I couldn't sell back then is pain. Cheap opiates and blah. Well, look what Vertex is doing.
Sure.
And frankly, I think there's really good opportunities for non-opiate pain, non-addicting pain medicines, mechanisms that have been just unraveled in the last decade. So look at immuno-oncology. Look what we were doing. Everybody was going after driver mutations that cause cancer. This is the precision oncology, until some dudes came up and said, well, that's a good thing to do, but if you just boost the immune system and Keytruda, some pretty big drugs. Actually, that was one area, that was one area where, and I take some blame for this, we missed the boat a little bit. And Lilly, obviously is doing a great job in oncology. But sometimes it's really hard to predict. And the other thing about the ecosystem I find interesting is if you look at where these drugs started, these sort of things that nobody should have been working on, a lot of them started in biotech, not in big pharma. Not to take anything away from big pharma. And that's why that ecosystem is so important. Sorry for the interruption.
No, I'm really glad you touched upon that, because especially for our private company attendees here today, you are part of that innovative ecosystem. In many ways, it's actually a de facto, maybe even de jure relationship between smaller cap biotech that arguably is taking on higher risk products, maybe can run a little bit faster, as part of what we call, this is a little bit of a euphemistic statement, this external innovation system, which is to say large cap with its very large R&D budgets, but also its very large sales forces, at some point will buy, we helped Steve sell Karuna to Bristol for $14 billion, because it belongs in the hands of a large cap pharma with a much more skilled operation. And so this is the case for much of the evolution of the biotech ecosystem over the last 50 years, because what we have is smaller biotechs being funded by VC, higher cost of capital. Many will fail, sadly. Some will go public. Some will actually get that capital, go raise funds for a follow-on. Some will get to phase 3. Some will even get to the market. But many of those most promising drugs, from a patient perspective, not just a cost of capital or a investor perspective, they in many ways belong in the hands of large cap pharma, and then people get recycled. On the recycling topic, and I think of interest for especially our private company operators here, let's talk a little bit about M&A, both public and private. And I'll just offer a little bit of backdrop for our then panelists and comment further. So over the last couple of years, biopharma M&A has really ebbed and flowed. Last year, we saw about $140 billion overall in aggregate of biopharma M&A. Removing Seagen, that was a very large deal that happened to close last year, it was still about $100 billion. Partly because of Steve Paul, in that the year accelerated towards the back half with a number of larger deals heading into Henry's prior company, AbbVie, bought ImmunoGen for $10 billion. That was Thanksgiving. Bristol bought Karuna for $14 billion. So that acceleration last year. Okay. Overall, last year, again, we saw $140 billion across 57 deals. This year so far, again, I highlighted Karuna, $14 billion. ImmunoGen, we also sold $10 billion. Reata, we also sold $7 billion. There's been no deal larger than $5 billion this year. Okay, so I think to a lot of investors' chagrin, while there's been 34 deals this year, which you could argue is on pace with last year, the overall scale has only added up to 34 billion. And we're already in August. So it's been a much slower M&A year. You oftentimes see this heading into election as just one factor. IRA, Steve also mentioned, FTC and the like, but it's been a slower M&A year. And so I highlight that as backdrop because even though it's been slower, the competition is still very high for the assets that make sense, right? So Karuna competitive process, ImmunoGen competitive process. A lot of the deals this year have been competitive. And so because of that competition for fewer and fewer assets, what we've seen is last year, for instance, 54% of deals, public company, had more than one bidder. That's the most of the last 5 years. This year so far, you've seen the median time elapse between the first bid and the final bid, 21 days, 3 weeks, just 3 weeks for some of these processes versus say 36 days last year, all of which are just driving higher and higher premia. So this year's median premium for biotech deals, as few as they've been, is 81%, which is the highest of the last 5 years. So I offer that as a little bit of a backdrop for then, Adrian, if you'd like to start, obviously from your perch, you observe all of this competition. How are you guys thinking about navigating this competitive environment?
Sure, I would agree. Fiercely competitive environment, and as I mentioned before, we're always scanning, always looking for opportunities. I would say on the larger M&A, that's typically not within the strategy that we're pursuing. You know, what's driving that across large pharma is solving for near-term patent expiries and revenue challenges, which for Lilly in this horizon is not the case. So it's more challenging for us to create value. Although we take a look, we don't tend to participate aggressively in that element of M&A. So we're primarily looking at smaller deals. Recently announced the acquisition of Morphic, which again was building on a strength in immunology and a bet on a target and a modality to strengthen our presence there. So while we acknowledge that environment, not necessarily one that we're competing aggressively in.
You're lucky in that you're not needing. There's no dire need for Lilly to be competing the same way that a lot of your peers are. So, yeah. Henry?
Well,
Lots of different hats, and I know.
Yeah, I think your comments are a good framing, really for the investors and the operators here. That I think when you're on the big pharma side of things, M&A can and should be a strategy, right? What are the white spaces I'm filling? What are the therapeutic areas I'm trying to enhance? To Adrian's point, what maybe am I not as successful at internally that I find a better solution externally? So that's all very, very important. Now, if you're on the biotech side of things, though, I don't think M&A should be a strategy. You know, M&A is an outcome of just building solid companies and advancing really, really good science. I used to say in my old job, you know, biotech companies are bought, not sold. So meaning, if you're on the biotech and you plan, okay, if I get this and this data, then I'll be sold. Yeah, maybe you get lucky and that actually does happen, but more often than not, I would not really advise that to be the plan. I would really think about how do I fund, you know, beyond that next step to ideally 2 or 3 steps in advance, and how do I just build a great company? And then, of course, when you do that, chances are at some point a big pharma is going to come knocking. And by the way, at that particular point, even if you want to actually pursue the M&A deal, you'll be in a much better position to negotiate if you don't have to do anything because you have a strong balance sheet and you have a plan to build a lot of standalone value. So I think that's a very important takeaway for the group. I think the second one is that you know, M&A certainly is very visible, and certainly the popular press tends to track M&A and all of that. The reality is partnering deals in some way, shape, or form is, you know, 10 to 20x the volume of M&A deals. And frankly, in most cases, most even acquirers would prefer partnering, right? You can allocate risk differently, you don't have to put as much capital, and frankly, you take advantage of both parties, hopefully enhancing each other and creating a solution. So I guess the takeaway is don't just only think about M&A, think about is there a partnership strategy? Again, can a Lilly offer capabilities, guidance, capital, mentorship, whatever it might be, to get you to be more successful? And even though that may not be a near-term exit, it could actually generate much more value down the road. And so I think those are my two key points.
Well, let me just begin by underscoring what Henry just said. For those entrepreneurs and company builders in the audience, you want to be bought, not sold. And I, frankly, just to give you a little bit of our Karuna example, we weren't looking to be acquired. Jerry, you know that. We were scaling up to launch a new product. We were bringing in people who had expertise in selling medicines. I switched from being the CEO of the company for 4.5 years to being the CSO of the company, so that somebody could come in and be the CEO, knew something about selling, marketing, commercializing drugs, and did a great job, by the way. We brought in some just amazing people. And it was bittersweet, obviously. And from a shareholder perspective, you know, we were acquired for $14 billion, and that's a lot of money. You can also look at it, but if we had launched a $5 billion a year drug,
Sure.
Zyprexa with none of the side effects and something that works on kite, what would our market cap be, Jerry?
You yourself could be a Regeneron of,
Right out of my window was the Vertex building.
Sure, there you go. You yourself could be a Vertex.
When I recruited our CEO, I said, that's what we want to do. Their market cap, by the way, I think is higher than BMS, if I'm not mistaken.
Sadly, yeah, it's like a 120 versus,
Yeah. So, but on the other hand, as our board considered this, and the board has a responsibility, fiduciary responsibility to shareholders, and looking at all the variables, and you said it best, who had the muscle, the wherewithal, financial and talent, and intellectual muscle to really get this to patients in the best way, and took a lot of risk off the table. This drug has still not been approved by the FDA. By the way, if there's anyone here from the FDA, please, just kidding. But, we'll know at the end of September. All things considered, that's what we did. But it was pretty bittersweet. Some of us had a different goal, a different aspiration. But we kept our heads down. Now, boards always have to be, up on, process around, somebody comes a call and you have to be ready for it. But we really didn't sit around in our conference room saying, gosh, our strategy is to be acquired. That was never a conversation at all at Karuna. So it happens, and I think it happens for the best reasons. But think about what you can deliver to patients, shareholders, yourself, and just work your tail off at doing that. So.
I couldn't agree with that more. Obviously, my day job is buying and selling companies. It's very clear when a company is being built only to be sold. It is very clear when the CEO is not focused on kind of longer term strategy, but rather just putting lipstick on the pig. And so I certainly keep that in mind, and that people can oftentimes see that you are not building for the future, which has implications for obviously the kind of the infrastructure that you're building and your focus on long-term value creation. I think, Henry, before we leave this concept, you've talked a little bit before about what you've observed in terms of barbells, the barbells that we're seeing in the kind of the M&A landscape with respect to, it feels like a lot of earlier stage M&A as well as some later stage M&A, and sometimes not that much in between. Would you like to expound?
Yeah, I think that to Adrian's point, there's some pharmas that are in pretty good shape with respect to their portfolios and their growth outlook, and so less patent expiries, and so those groups are a bit more focused on earlier innovation and again sort of disruptive technologies. And for some of those, buying the technology can actually make some sense, just so you can very broadly apply it across many different opportunities. And then also importantly, the dollars are important, and the dollars aren't as big. So you can, for a few $100 million maybe buy something versus the sort of middle tier where maybe there's some clinical data, but still some de-risking has to take place. That's actually where a lot of partnering makes a lot of sense, because as an investor, maybe I can invest in 10 companies that have sort of binary phase 2 risk, and maybe that's a good strategy. But if you're in pharma, you don't want to buy 10 of those companies and kind of succeed with 2 and not succeed with 5 others and break even on a few. So it's often that M&A has to wait until opportunities are more fully de-risked. So Karuna would be an example. Yes, it's not approved, but I think it's widely believed to be de-risk and really more of a commercial opportunity with really no development risk left. And so it's often that's when M&A takes place, or very early in the middle is often partnering. Now, of course, there's always some exception, but in general, and that's kind of what we're seeing this year. I mean, there's been a lot of early private company M&A, again, and the dollars have been, these are still sizable amounts, but $500 million, $1 billion, $1.5 billion, but not 10 to 20. It's more episodic to see the $15 billion, $20 billion type public company deal. And that tends to be for very de-risked opportunities on the other side. So that's kind of what we're seeing, and I actually don't think that's likely to change. I think we're going to continue to see that picture.
Yep. In the time that we have left, I'm going to ask each of you for a piece of advice for our audience. I'm going to start with the inimitable Dr. Paul. You've obviously founded many companies, you take companies public. For the founders and operators in the audience, especially those that are thinking about going public, advice for them?
Well, again, I'll just repeat what I said earlier. Don't make M&A your strategy. I mean, you're always going to think about it. We're not dumb. We're going to think about it, but try to build a company and build a company on the basis of some new, in my case, biotech medicine that's going to help people with and fill a niche that isn't filled yet. One other comment I'll make, I want to say this, size matters, Donald Trump. Anyway, I'll get in trouble if I'm not careful here. But, one of the best deals that I did when I was at Lilly, and I have to give Tom Bumall, I don't think Tom's around, a lot of credit for this, is we bought a small company called Applied Molecular Evolution, one of the last antibody engineering companies on the planet, based in San Diego. It's $400 million acquisition, and that served as a huge catalyst for Lilly's protein engineering, antibody technology, even some of the polypeptide stuff. So I think there's a lot of ways to provide something, and it's not necessarily, that blockbuster product. This one was the gift that kept on giving. So, but my advice, and pretty much what Henry just said, hey, think about building a great company, put your head down, work hard, and you'll see what happens.
Excellent. Well said. Henry, for the CEOs in the audience, advice for them?
I would say raise as much capital as you can with no offense to any of the VCs. Don't worry about dilution. Raise as much capital as you can. But run the company as if you had no capital or very little capital. Be very, very mindful of every single decision. We have, $400 million plus in cash, and we sweat over, $50,000 tweaks to our, preclinical model. So you kind of have to do both, and it's sort of one of those sayings. Nobody's ever gone bankrupt from dilution. When the capital is available, and by the way, often it's available when you don't really need it. Take advantage of it, but use it very wisely, to Steve's point, to build a great company and to invest in great science.
And Adrian, for the heads of strategy or heads of M&A in the audience, advice for them?
Yeah, I think, I would also say be obsessed with solving problems for patients. That's sort of, how I look at my job. At Lilly, we've got to continue innovating if we want to continue to thrive in the future. And so we're looking for those breakthroughs, those areas of unmet need where great science can come together to unlock opportunity. That's really what we're driven by. I think if you solve for that first, that'll really be the foundation that makes those M&A efforts not just successful in the short term, but really pay off in the long term for your organization, but then also for people.
I think we might have time for one question if there's anything from the audience.
Maybe as the audience thinks about it, I'll have one other advice to the operators, which is, there's often a perception with small companies that goes as follows. Okay, I need to first sort of figure everything out, and when I have everything figured out, then I will talk to pharma, or then I will talk to kind of a bigger biotech company. And the reality is, it's a very interactive ecosystem, and pharma is very, very willing to, frankly, give free advice, to build relationships, to as Adrian said, to help mentor, and that really matters. I mean, in my old job, again, we would meet companies very early on, and we just would have a scientific exchange. And then 2 years later, when, okay, the data from so-and-so study is available, or so-and-so piece of information is available, you've built that rapport, and then maybe you decide to become partners. And had that company only started at that point to have discussions, again, there was no placebo controls. I can't tell you that it wouldn't have happened, but it sure feels like that discussion 2 years earlier made a lot of sense. So I would say don't be shy in just establishing a relationship, going out, meeting people. I'm sure Adrian has lots of people doing just that. I think that's often underappreciated by small companies, how valuable that can be for both sides.
I would add to that. I think, there's companies that we've gone on to do a strategic transaction with that have said, Lilly gave us advice, for free, 3 years ago that helped move the science forward. So we're highly motivated to do that, whether it turns into a strategic transaction or not. And then we also have vehicles for doing that. We launched what we call Lilly Catalyze 360. That's really all about partnering and giving back to the biotech ecosystem with a number of avenues to just support founders where they are and help move great science forward.
Maybe actually I'll summarize some of the panel's advice and give you some of my own, having seen this movie 100 different times, which is for those private companies, CEOs, CFOs, heads of BD, I couldn't agree more with Adrian, which is the more patient-minded and focused you are and the less sale-focused you are, I think the better team, the better VC backing, the better board you will build. And you'll need those constituents to do anything. I think as Henry said, the age-old mantra of, a penny saved is a penny raised. You will want every single possible dollar of capital you can possibly get all the time, putting aside dilution, and also you'll ideally spend as little as possible so that you can actually see yourself through preclinical phase 1, phase 2. You'll want to surround yourself with other patient-minded people, your CFO, your CBO, your CSO, your CMO, because that right team will attract the right investors, the right VCs. Those VCs, by the way, stay with you in ideal situation through Series A, Series B, Series C, crossover, then IPO. And so it's very important to treat them as relationships. I'm sure that's very obvious. And then lastly, the board that you build around you, for the CEOs in the audience, is equally important. It's like having the right in-laws there for Thanksgiving. You want the right-minded people that share the same mission and also bring the right skills. You may have a commercial background, you may have a science background, you may have an M&A background, and therefore you want to fill out your board with the other skills that you don't have because you want those people over your shoulder giving you advice. So I know that's a lot to consume, but I'd like to thank my panelists for their time today. I think it's been, for me, like a really interesting snapshot into really different perspectives, different apertures as relates to buyers and sellers, innovators, and acquirers. So thank you to each of you, and I hope all of you enjoy the panel. Thanks.
Thank you.